Hi, Assalamualaikum and good day everyone. In this video, I'm going to continue to part 2 of mapping ER model to relational model. In previous video, I already show you how to map the ER diagram to relational model using these 3 steps. So the first one is we go through how to identify the strong and weak entities. And from this entity, we identify which attribute, which type of the attribute for that have in both entity, and we have to classify either it is simple attribute, composite attribute, or multi-value attribute. Okay, then we go to the mapping of one-to-many relationship for the entity. So in this video, I'm going to continue for one-to-one relationship mapping from ER diagram to relational model. Okay, so for one-to-one relationship, there are 3 options depending on the participation of the entity. So for option A, you have to choose option A if the participation on both sides is mandatory. So if it is mandatory on both sides, you have to merge both entity into a single entity. And then you can choose either one of the primary key as the new primary key. And you have to include all the attributes inside the relation. As you can see in the example here, we have two entity that is manager and branch. So for manager, we have manager ID, name and salary. And branch, we have branch name, address and phone number. Branch name as the primary key. So in this case, we have to merge because here you can see the participation is mandatory for both entity. So you have to merge both entity into a single entity. So here we have branch number, branch address and telephone number, manager number, manager name, date of appointment and bonus. So when we merge this both entity, we get a single entity that we name it branch, and we merge all the attribute into one entity. So from this entity, we map it into the relation model. Okay, so we have the branch number, as the entity name. So all the attribute here, and we take the primary key that is branch number into the relation. So for the second option, option B is for entity that have mandatory participation on one side. So if you have mandatory participation on one side, you have to keep both relation, okay? And you take the optional participation as parent and relation with mandatory participation as child. And then you add the primary key of parent to child as the foreign key, and you if there are any attribute in the relationship, you put it in the child entity. So for example here, we have manager and branch. So you can see here the participation is mandatory on one side and optional on the other side. So we consider the optional participation as parent and mandatory participation as child. So what we have to do is we take the primary key from parent, make it as foreign key for child. Okay, so here we have two relation. So next for option C is for entity that have optional participation on both sides. So here you can choose one entity as child and another as parent, and as usual, you have to add the primary key from parent to child. Okay, we see this example. So in here, this example here, you can see that both participation is optional. So for here, I choose manager as the parent and branch as child. So what we have to do is we take the primary key from parent, become the foreign key for child. So this is how you have to do for one-to-one relationship. What about a recursive relationship? So for recursive relationship, it still depends on the cardinality of the relation. Is it one-to-one, one-to-many, or many-to-many? So if it is, so if you can see here in this example, we have one entity that is staff. Okay, so staff has relationship with staff as supervisor and supervisee. So here we can say that one staff have one supervisor and one supervisor assigned to one staff. So each staff member has one supervisor and one staff may supervise one staff member. So here, if it is one-to-one, you can use the one-to-one rules relationship. Is it both mandatory, both optional, or either one is mandatory? If it is one-to-many relationship, for example, this is for one relation, for both mandatory, so you can have one relation and you can put the supervisor ID. So supervisor ID, the data is same like staff ID. But you create another attribute as supervisor ID to show the relationship of a recursive relationship. So if it is one-to-many, you will have two relationship. Means that one supervisor might have supervised more than one staff. So you can have two relation. So one is staff, and then the second one is supervision, where you put staff ID for the staff that supervisee, and supervisor ID for the supervisor. So this is for step 5 for recursive relationship. Next is for step 6, the superclass and subclass relationship. Okay, for superclass and subclass relationship, you have to identify the participation and disjoint constraint. Is it mandatory or optional, and or? So you have to identify the participation and disjoint constraint. So each one have different way of mapping the ER model. So as you can see here in the example, the case that we are trying to solve. So here we can see that agent have is the superclass, permanent and temporary is the subclass, and the participation is mandatory, and disjoint is all. Okay, so in this case, we have to refer back to the table that we have here. So it is mandatory or means that you should have many relation. So one relation for each combined superclass and subclass. Okay, so there are 4 possibilities here: mandatory and, optional and, mandatory or, optional or. So the first example we are going to use is for the example used is mandatory or. Okay, so we will go through one by one how to map the ER diagram to the relational model that consists of superclass and subclass. So for the first example of first combination, that is mandatory and. So here, for example, we have owner, okay, as the superclass, and we have business owner and private owner. So here we have mandatory and as the constraint. Okay, so for mandatory and, what you have to do is to combine the relation into single relation, okay, with one or more discrimination to distinguish the type of each tuple. So here we will combine all. So here we have owner, okay, and we have all the attribute into one relation. That is owner ID, this is owner address, okay, owner address, telephone, and then owner name. Okay, here we have owner name, company name, and contact person. So we combine all, and the primary key for parent become the primary key for the relation model. Next, the second one is optional and. So for optional and, we will have 2 relations. One relation for superclass and one relation for all the subclass. You see the example here. So here we have optional and as the constraint. So we have two relation, one relation for the superclass and one relation for all the subclass. So for superclass, we have here owner, owner ID, address, and telephone. The primary key is owner ID. And for subclass, we have here private business. So we combine all the subclass, private business, and we combine all the attribute. So we have here owner name, company name, contact person. Okay, but don't forget you have to add primary key from the superclass. So you have to have here primary key. Okay, so the primary key is owner ID. So here primary key owner ID. So this is for the second case. So the third case is mandatory or. So for mandatory or, you will have many relation. So one relation for each combined superclass and subclass. Okay, if you can see the example here, we have owner, business owner, and private owner with mandatory or constraint. So what you have to do is you combine superclass and subclass. For each subclass, you will have to combine it with superclass. Means that the number of relation you will have is the number of subclass that you have. So for the first subclass is private owner. So you combine it with owner. So you have here private owner, owner ID, owner address, telephone, and then owner name. Primary key, owner ID. Primary key always be from the parent. And then the next one is business owner. Okay, the second subclass. So here we have also owner ID, owner address from the parent, telephone from parent, and then company name and contact person from the subclass. And then the primary key is owner ID. Okay, so this is for the third case. That is mandatory or. And lastly is optional or. Means that you will have many relation, one relation for superclass and one for each subclass. So if you have optional or, the number of relation that you have will be the same number of the entity that you have. Okay, so for example here you have 3 entity, owner, business owner, and private owner. So the relation that you have is also 3. One for owner, one private owner, and one business owner. But for superclass and subclass, you always have the primary key for parent. So for owner, the primary key is owner ID. Private owner, the primary key also owner ID. And business owner, the primary key is also owner ID. So I think for part 2 of mapping ER diagram to relational model, I will end it here. So the next part, we will go for many-to-many relationship. So see you in the next video.